I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. On tonight's episode, we talk about the Las Vegas Bowl. Gators get picked to go to Vegas to play the Oregon State Beavers. Plus, college football playoff is announced. The NFL draft got a few guys declaring for that. Transfer portal got more than a few guys in the portal. And we'll talk about the new hires across college football for a dollar. First up, before we jump in, Will, how's it going, man?
I enjoying it. It's raining up here, which is weird in December. Usually when it rains, it's like it's not usually this time of year you're starting to get snow. So thankful that I'm not gonna be slipping and sliding to work tomorrow. But no, it's good. It's weird. The season's over. It feels like it just raced by. Right. And I think it always feels like that, but it feels like as I get older, it races faster and faster and faster. So excited to sort of have my weeks back a little bit, though also a little bit down because we only got one left.
Yeah, it's always tough to see college football season go, but hey, it's a lot of fun while it's here. Uh, we are making just a quick announcement. We already recorded, I should say, a DJ Lagway video. So if Lagway commits to Florida, we will release that video. If not, you didn't hear this. No big deal.
Nah, nothing happened. I don't know what you're talking about. Make sure you don't do like 24/7 did with McLean and just release the video talking about how
just
well
have,
he did.
just have
Going
the
to,
preset release for 5 minutes after his commit time. No, we won't do that.
yeah, that'd
But
probably be bad.
But if you're wondering why that's not a topic on the show tonight, check it out. Stay tuned for another video. Or forget it. Or forget it. All right, let's jump into two bits here. Let's talk about that Las Vegas Bowl. The Gators will meet Oregon State out at Allegiant Stadium on December 17th, Saturday, December 17th. And seeing as there's a mass exodus going on in the transfer portal, not just at the University of Florida, but across the country. It's a completely fluid situation, especially here over the next week leading up to the game. Doesn't make a ton of sense to dive into the specifics and the matchups of the game itself. So what we'll do is we'll just preview. We'll take a look at Oregon State, what they've accomplished this season, and give some brief thoughts on the game before heading into four bits here, Will. But Oregon State finished 9-3 after playing spoiler to rival Oregon in the Civil War. The Ducks had a shot to go to the Pac-12 title, and the Beavers knocked them off on the home turf there. Aside from being blown out at Utah, Oregon State's other two losses have been just by a single field goal to USC and Washington, two schools that were in contention for the Pac-12 title all year. OSU is led by an explosive offense, scoring 30 or more in 7 games this year. And after bottoming out at 1-11 in 2017, they brought Jonathan Smith on board, former Oregon State quarterback back in the day, I believe under Dennis Erickson. I think he was that quarterback of that Fiesta Bowl team that beat Notre Dame, if I'm not mistaken. Well, OSU has slowly rebuilt itself into a very tough out on a week-to-week basis. This is not a program that wins at a high level consistently. We've seen plenty of good Oregon State teams over the years with Mike Riley, Dennis Erickson, and such, but it's not. You don't typically see the Beavers at 9 wins, Will. So this is one of the better Oregon State teams that have been out there in quite some time.
Yeah, so first off, I have to give you props because I just went and looked it up right as you were talking, and absolutely the Fiesta Bowl team under Dennis Erickson in 2000 had Jonathan Smith as the quarterback.
Yeah.
So if anybody ever wonders why Nick sort of wanders off the wanders off into the plane and talks about college football other than just Florida football, this is why. This dude has an encyclopedic knowledge of what's going on. It's like that for Florida, but it's like that for the entire sport as well. I have no idea who Jonathan Smith was before this podcast, other than the fact that he was the coach of Oregon State. I had no idea.
Chad Johnson was on that team too. That was they whooped Notre Dame in that Fiesta Bowl.
Yeah,
that was a big time win.
It's interesting. You talk about the one score losses, and I think that's something you want to take a look at. But I also think you need to take the one score wins. So they had a one score win over Fresno State, 35-32. They had a one score win over Stanford, 28-27. A one score win over Oregon, 38-34. So, this is a team that's played a lot of close games and could have been 9-3, could have been 6-6, depending upon how those sorts of close games turned out. It's not a team that's necessarily going to blow you out of the water. Now, look, I mean, I think we all sort of know that Florida's coming in, and we don't know what to expect given all the guys who are out. Ben Gulbranson is the quarterback there for Oregon State, averaged 7.4 yards per attempt. Chance Nolan was in there before him. averaging 8.5 yards an attempt. Both QB ratings around 135. So this isn't a team that's going to like blow you out of the water when it comes to throwing the ball. From an advanced stats perspective, they're a much better passing team than they are a running team though. And on the defensive side of the ball, they're much better against the pass than against the rush. In fact, they're kind of bad against the rush. And so if you think about where Florida might have an advantage, Montrell Johnson's still there, and ETN is still there, and most of the offensive line is still there. And so you think about where Florida might really have an advantage. I think the running game is the place you're going to look at, and the place where Oregon State wasn't great this year anyway, and Florida was great. Obviously, some of that has to do with Anthony Richardson. He's not around for this one at all. But at the same time, not everybody who was involved in that running game is gone. So Florida will have an opportunity, I think, to put up some points here. But considering that the Florida defense hadn't stopped anybody when they had everybody, and all cylinders shooting, I'm not sure that it's necessarily going to be not sure that's necessarily going to be the best measure of what's going on. But we are going to see a lot of young guys, right? I mean, with all the announcements for the transfer portal, with all the announcements for the NFL, with all the dismissals and that sort of stuff, and there's like 25 or 26 guys who were on the roster who aren't going to be there. But I did see an announcement today that Dexter actually is going to play the bowl game. So, there will be some guys who decide to stay, decide to play. Guys like Ventrell Miller. I mean, I saw Miller accepted a spot at the Senior Bowl either today or yesterday. And again, he's going to have an opportunity to go out and show the NFL what he can do. So there's going to be some guys out there who want to show what they can do. I don't think that this is going to be the Oklahoma, we just lost out on the national championship and the SEC championship and the LSU and Alabama games prior to that one just sort of put a sour taste in everybody's mouth. And I think everybody just wanted that year to be over because that was the COVID year and the bowl game was like 6 days after the SEC championship game or something like that. In this case, they will have had a lot of time to practice. They will have had a lot of time to get either Jack Miller or Max Brown ready to be quarterback. And I think in some respects, the running game isn't going to go away. So I actually do expect this to be a pretty good game. I think it makes sense that Oregon State would be favored. At the same time, look, I mean, stranger things have happened, man. It's bowl season, and if nothing else, these guys are gonna have a good time out in Vegas.
It's funny. I'm usually the optimist, and you're usually crushing my dreams. I'm not overly optimistic about this matchup. I think this is a fun matchup. I would much rather go to Vegas and play Oregon State than play, some garbage team in the Birmingham. But
Iowa,
I don't want to do that. So I'm happy that we're going out to Vegas. We got an interesting matchup. Oregon State is a highly entertaining team too. If you're like me and you like to stay up and watch some of those Pac-12 games late, I don't know if I've watched an entire Oregon State game, but I've watched a lot of quarters of Oregon State football throughout the year. They are a fun team to watch. So not a great matchup on the defensive side for the Gators. I do think Oregon State will score in this one. Although I am speaking, like I said, the mass exodus of the transfer portal, I'm barely keeping up with what's going on in Gainesville, Will. I don't know how many guys, I don't know the total situation Oregon State's got coming into the game either. So we'll take a closer look at that next week for sure. But on paper, this offense against the Florida defense, that's going to be a lot of points. It's going to be
on
a lot
paper,
of points.
any offense against the Florida defense.
I know, but this is a good offense. This is a good high up tempo offense that knows how to score. And buckle up and get ready for we're going to have to score a lot of points if we're going to keep pace with them. And we're already down to at least our third string quarterback there.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been an interesting week with the quarterbacks of Florida. Obviously, we talked about the Kitna situation last week, and I don't think I think it feels dirty to talk about sort of the quarterback situation in relation to that. But with Richardson leaving for the NFL, obviously there's a spot for somebody to step up. You have an opportunity, right? If you're Jack Miller and you want to be the starting quarterback next year, there's been a lot of rumblings about Florida and the transfer portal and who they're going after. And there's only 4,700 guys who are in the transfer portal at this point. And it seems like 4,600 of them are quarterbacks. So, there's going to be an opportunity.
It's like all the ACC.
There's going to be an opportunity for Florida to pick somebody up. And so this is an opportunity for a Jack Miller or a Max Brown to really take their step forward and say, look, you need to give me an opportunity in camp to win. That this isn't going to just be you come to Florida as a transfer and all of a sudden you're given the starting jobs. No, you're going to have to win it. And this is that first step. So, the interesting thing is that given what happened in 2021, the Oklahoma game was sort of the beginning of the end. And it felt like, Mullen had sort of lost control in 2021. I do wonder whether that Oklahoma game was sort of the start of that. And maybe even the LSU and the Alabama games a little bit in terms of the start of that. But this is the very beginning of the Napier era, and I don't think the way these
Yeah,
guys have
I'm not
fought
worried
all
about a
year.
checkout. You're not concerned about that, are you? At
No, I'm
all?
not. No, I'm not worried about a checkout. What I'm worried about
Yeah.
is we got a third or a fourth string quarterback against a
Yeah.
real against a
The
real
actual facts
Pac-12
of the
team.
game.
So yeah, I mean, look,
Yeah.
it turns out that if 2013 is the last time we saw the third string quarterback for the Florida Gators in any sort of significant playing time. And Skylar Morhenweg is not a guy
Oof.
who we're bouncing our kids on our knee, or our grandkids on our knee, talking about in Florida Gator lore. So I'm not incredibly optimistic that the quarterback play is going to be fantastic, but I'm also pretty optimistic that Oregon State's probably going to give Florida a couple of shots. The question is going to be, can you hit them? And I Oregon State is a weird one because you look at their profile, even under Jonathan Smith, they have not been a great team over the last 4 or 5 years. This is sort of one of those up years. And a lot of one score games. So I don't think this is a game that gets like out of hand really early on, unless Florida's defense just sort of comes, gives up a couple of touchdowns early, and then rolls over. And that has happened a little bit. I sort of described, I had an article on Read and Reaction about Anthony Richardson and how he was sort of he was the quintessential avalanche, right? Like it was either everything was rolling and getting better on the good side, or everything was rolling and getting better on the bad side. And I kind of feel like the defense has had that personality as well. That the LSU game, like the perfect example, they give up a touchdown to start that game and then just can't stop it. And 6 drives later, LSU scored a touchdown on every drive, and there was just no way to stop the Avalanche. Same thing against Florida State in that second half the other day when Florida's offense was going 3 and out. If Florida's defense could have just stopped them to field goals, or if Florida's defense could have just gotten an additional 3 and out and gotten them to punt back over, then it would have made a difference. Instead, it just sort of snowballed, and they end up with this avalanche. So that, I think, is the thing that I want to see. I actually don't mind if the defense gets punched in the mouth. The question is, how do they respond when they get punched in the mouth? And do they respond in a way that's positive, or are they going to respond the same way they sort of responded all year, where it just sort of avalanches out of control? I suspect that with some of the departures and some of the young guys who are going to get in there, we'll see some mistakes, but I'm hoping that the mistakes will be mistakes of aggression and not mistakes of, oh no, here we go again.
Yeah, it does feel a little like we're playing this game with one hand tied behind our back a little bit, but
All I know
I
is
think
this.
it's
This
going
is
to
why
be.
I'm fully in agreement with Gator Dave that these games should just be the first game of the year. Like,
It is a glorified exhibition at this point, but I think it can take shape into it can shape into positive momentum heading into the offseason, particularly under a new regime, and especially if some of these young guys step up, make some plays. Hey, it could be a lot of fun. We could have a great win. Go in there. I go in there with no expectations as a fan base a little bit and come out there surprised. So that could be the case too. So we'll see how it is. Next week, we'll get more into the details of the game specifically because we'll have more information on who's actually playing and whatnot. But in the meantime, let's move on. In addition to the Gators bowl destination, all the bowls were announced. We're not going to go over all of them here, but let's talk about the college football playoff real quick. You got Ohio State versus Georgia in the 1 versus 4, TCU versus Michigan in the 2 versus 3. Will, I think it's an atrocity that TCU did not suffer more for that loss. I know they only lost by 3 in the Big 12 championship, but the fact that that game essentially did not matter whatsoever. And you could say, oh, Alabama was sitting at home, Ohio State was sitting at home. Yes, but Alabama and Ohio State have just as much to show for their seasons as TCU does now. And you lost to a 3-loss team. You lost to a 3-loss team in the Big 12 title game who, yes, you beat earlier in the season. That's one of your 4 ranked wins. The others, Oklahoma, who's now 6-6, Kansas, who's now 6-6. You beat Kansas State, who beat you in the Big 12 title game. And I believe the other, correct me if I'm wrong, Will, was what? Oklahoma State? Did they beat Okie State?
I think so.
Yeah. So a lot of close wins mixed in there. I know everyone seems to love Duggan, and it's a good story. Sonny Dykes is awesome. I do like Sonny Dykes a lot. I think the TCU's been a fantastic story. But man, I personally, I would have gone with Ohio State and Alabama, that even with 2 losses over TCU. I don't love that the Frogs not only got in. I don't love that the Frogs are number 3. I think they should. If you're in, you should be number 4 at best.
Well, so 2 things. They weren't going to have Michigan and Ohio State play again to start with. They were going to make them play in the
Michigan,
finale.
Ohio State, and Alabama, Georgia wouldn't have been an interesting playoff.
I mean, it would have been an interesting playoff, but they weren't going to have them play again, right? They were going, if they were going to put Alabama in there, they were going to stagger it to where Georgia didn't play Alabama and where Ohio State didn't play Michigan.
That would have been
And
awesome.
so that's what you, and now, yes, that would have been an awesome Final Four, and we would have enjoyed every one of those games,
Yeah.
and we would have sat there and looked and said, you know what, Michigan might have a shot at beating Alabama here, but Alabama is a worthy opponent. I think we all expect Michigan to just run roughshod over TCU, and hey, this is what they decided, right? They decided that they were going to look at the resumes and go, losses matter. And, essentially we're back in the old days where, a better team may have lost in a better conference, but we're going to allow the undefeated team that's clearly the inferior team get in there. And, you and I've been talking about the SEC championship for a while. And obviously LSU ruined that by losing to A&M before they went into the SEC championship. But I was making the same case, right? That if they beat Georgia in the SEC championship, then the SEC championship means nothing, because winning the SEC championship, winning the best conference in the country, should lead to a path to a national championship. Same thing. If you're in an inferior conference, and the Big 12 is an inferior conference, if you're in an inferior conference and you lose your conference championship game, so TCU isn't even the conference champion from the Big 12, and they're in the playoffs. So basically what we have done by putting this 14 playoff in with the structure that it's in right now is render these conference championship games completely either irrelevant or as just a punishment, right? So USC plays in its conference championship game and loses that game to Utah.
Second loss of the season for USC.
And now they get knocked out, right? So at least it mattered in that case. But, TCU's escaped multiple times.
Texas, by the way, was their other ranked win, not Oklahoma State.
There you go.
That just came to me. Sorry.
So again, we're not talking about like major powerhouses that they're beating there in the Big 12. Yeah. The schedule was kind of cake. They took advantage of it. Good for them. And had they run the table, I think they would have had a really good argument. But to your point, if you're going to have these conference championship games and they mean nothing other than being able to, like, I'd be like, this is what I hope happens with the 12-team playoff is I hope they make automatic berths for winning the conference. So if you end up like a 6-6 team that ends up in the conference championship game and you win the damn thing, you're in, right? And then you got to fill in at-large bids and stuff like that. But that still sort of devalues it unless you have a team that isn't going to be in any otherwise, right? So maybe then you make conference champions like the top seeds, right? You say, hey, out of the Power Five, we're going to give the top 5 seeds to the conference champions.
Right.
And so if you're an at-large, you're going to
get a home game in the first round.
Yeah, you're going to have to go on the road, something like that. But as it sits right now, the college football has completely devalued its conference championship games, which were the crown jewel. When Kramer and those guys in the SEC decided back in the 1990s to put this thing in place, it gave the SEC a leg up, but it also was something that really positioned the conference to be able to have somebody move in the last week. Now, other conferences had to hurt them. I mean, I think who was it? Was it Nebraska that lost to Texas in one of the, or maybe it was Kansas State who lost to Texas in one of those Big 12 championship games years ago and knocked them out. There've been
A&M beat Kansas State and Texas beat Nebraska.
Yeah,
in 96 and 98.
There've been instances where these conference championship games have cost conferences, and the SEC that never happens because you always end up with 2 teams that could potentially go, and they don't. But I'll tell you, the most entertaining argument I heard actually was Clay Travis whining about Tennessee deserving to be in over Alabama because they both had 2 losses.
If Hooker was healthy, I would listen.
I absolutely agree. That's what made it so much fun. Is I enjoyed hearing Clay Travis whine about it, and also I kind of sort of agree with him, but I also understand why nobody has them there, because they absolutely got boat raced by a South Carolina team that nobody thinks is all that good. But again, I sort of go back and look at it and say, look, Alabama had an opportunity to get the job done. They had an opportunity to stop Tennessee. They didn't do it. They had an opportunity to beat LSU. They didn't do it. And, it's a little bit of a shame where you sit there and go, well, if they'd stopped that 2-point conversion against LSU, they're in the playoff. And because they don't, they're not.
I didn't shed a single tear for Alabama. It's not about fighting for Alabama. It's just looking at their resume and going, you lost by a field goal at Tennessee, a really good Tennessee team, which should be, assuming Hendon Hooker stays healthy, and they end up beating South Carolina that night, which had nothing to do with Hendon Hooker's health. Carolina was crushing them before he got hurt. But if they end up beating South Carolina that night, Tennessee's in that slot in the driver's seat to get that playoff spot, you got to assume. So that's a tough loss for Bama on the road. You go on the road into Death Valley to an LSU team who's not perfect, but they played some real good football the second half of the season. Does TCU win in either one of those spots? How about we just ask Georgia and Michigan, the teams that are in? You get three choices. Do you want to play Ohio State, Alabama, or Texas Christian? Which one are you choosing, Will? Like
I
it's
get I
I think
I
that's
get
a
I
clear choice, and I think the committee totally screwed it up. And I think at the end of the day, it's nice that you made the Big 12 title game, but you clearly didn't value it because you didn't punish them for losing. So it's like, oh, well, they went 12-0. Yeah, okay, against a mediocre schedule, you went 12-0. Again, I'm not crying that hard over this here. However, it's more like I thought with Bama in, you got two great games in the semis. Whereas now, I'm not even saying TCU isn't an okay team and they can't give Michigan a hard time, but it's like I said, if you ask Michigan, Ohio State, Bama, TCU, who you picking, they're going to pick TCU every time.
Well, all I know is I'm rooting for TCU because I hate Michigan, I hate Ohio State, and I hate Georgia. I hate Georgia more than I hate Ohio State, so I'm rooting for the Buckeyes while holding my nose to start with. But hell, if TCU wins the whole thing, nobody will be more thrilled than me. Just let them win the whole thing, and then we can laugh at the two stalwarts of the Big Ten and the hopefully the college football semifinalist Georgia Bulldogs. But I expect Georgia to beat Ohio State. I expect Michigan to beat TCU, and then I expect Georgia to beat Michigan. And we're going to end up with some pretty decent chalk this year, I think. And Alabama had a potential to change that, but look, they had their opportunity and didn't get it. And Saban can go on and talk about who are the best four teams all he wants at halftime. But you had an opportunity to get the job done, you didn't get the job done. Now, you can say the exact same thing about TCU, but the fact that you're saying that about both teams means that I'm okay with you choosing it one way or the other. And like I said, it gives me a different rooting interest. Now, I agree with you. I think I was surprised mainly because I figured the money that would come along with bringing Alabama into that game would be so significant that the committee would go, well, we'll go ahead and make this switch because it makes sense. But like you
It
said,
just treated it like fans, I thought, like where they're just like, well, we want someone different in there. Okay.
come on, man.
Oh,
Like
come on.
to actually believe college football is going to do what's best for the fans or the players, that never happens. So we just got to deal with the imperfections. That's one of the reasons college football is great, is all the weird intricacies that occur because you've got all these different entities that want different things, and that's just sort of the way it works.
And keep just to be clear, if TCU wins that game in the Big 12 title and they're 13-0, they absolutely deserve the spot. Absolutely. They didn't take care of business. I don't think their resume is any better than Alabama or Ohio State on paper, that especially getting a 3 seed. That's ridiculous. So anyway, there's always something with the college football playoff, right? You can always go off a rant on every year, but it's set. You got Alabama, or no, I'm sorry, you got Ohio State and Georgia in Atlanta with the Peach Bowl, and you got out west in the Fiesta Bowl, Michigan, TCU for the playoff. We'll see those games on December 31st. Will
Go Frogs.
Anthony Richardson, Jervon Dexter, and Osiris Torrance all declaring for the NFL draft this past week. Start with Richardson, Will, and I feel like we've talked about Richardson a ton this year, so we can keep this part a little more brief. But the thought process, I thought you explained it well. Just a lot of openings in the NFL right now for quarterbacks, even with teams that don't necessarily have the opening right this second. But you look at someone like the Minnesota Vikings with Kirk Cousins, I believe is an example you used, where, hey, this guy is getting older. He's got a few years. Perfect, almost a perfect situation for Richardson to go to, quite frankly. Go sit and develop for a couple of years behind a guy like that, and then get your shot in about year 3 or year 4. Hey, best of luck to Richardson. I'm a little stunned. I'm still like, I know you've been telling me this for like a month plus, and it's still, every time I think about it, I'm like, man, if there's one guy that could use another year of development, it's this guy. I love the high-end tools. I see them all. I understand the thought process with the scouts that want to see him out there, and he's probably going to grade very well in shorts. But, I'll be a big Anthony Richardson fan, but it's just a little disappointing at the end of his Florida career where it's like, man, it felt like we had someone that was going to do some really special things in orange and blue, and instead we pretty much got the development side of it without as many results as we were hoping for. But best of luck to Richardson on the next level.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, you look at it and say, like, I actually think the best place for him to go is New England. I think if he ends up in New England, there's rumblings that Brady may come back there. And if you ended up with Brady there for a year or two, essentially he'd be doing the Kyle Trask development cycle there, where he's learning behind Tom Brady.
It's going okay
But
for
I think
Trask.
I think that makes a lot of sense for a team, because New England is in this place right now where if you look at Mac Jones play, you're like, all right. He's He's not going to lead them to a Super Bowl. He's not Joe Burrow. He's not Pat Mahomes. He's certainly not Aaron Rodgers, and he's not Tom Brady. So if you're looking at that and you're saying, hey, we need to find the guy who can do that for us, this is why Anthony Richardson is going to get drafted, and why he's going to get drafted high. Because if you look at it, you go, we might be able to get a guy in the late first round, early second round, who, if he had stayed for another year, would have been the number one pick in the draft.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then you say, and we get to be the ones who develop him for that first year. So, you sign him to the contract, especially if he's a first rounder. Those are like I think those are 4-year contracts with a 5th year option. I can't remember exactly what the contracts are in the first round. There's a distinction between
it's a 5th-year option.
Yeah. So you essentially have the guy for 5 years if you take him as the last pick in the first round. And if he turns into a star, then you look brilliant. And if he doesn't turn into a star, well, assuming you already had a starter in there, you just sort of move on, and hey, it's fine. You didn't waste a ton of draft capital on bringing that guy in, right? You may have missed out on like a really effective linebacker or something like that, but you didn't miss out on, just a can't miss prospect. You didn't miss out on Micah Parsons or something like that. So that's the first part of it. And then from the Richardson side, you just look at it and go, there's such a risk to anything that you do when you're turning down long-term money for short-term money and short-term rewards. And, look, college football, I think we've seen, actually, I sent you a tweet today where somebody was saying essentially the talent level in the NFL draft has been pulled down because NIL is keeping guys in school, which is interesting because that then opens up an opportunity for Richardson to zag, right? You go into the NFL draft, and we see this every year where, Trey Lance wasn't a guy who anybody thought was going to be a top 10 draft pick when the draft season started. And all of a sudden, he's getting drafted up there. You think about a guy like Josh Rosen, who got drafted in the top 10. You think about a lot of the guys who've gotten you look at it early, even if you go back to like the Achilles Smith days and those sorts of things, guys that you look at and go, that guy wasn't the second or third best player in the draft, but the quarterback position is so important that we will overpay and over project and we will bring people in. So I actually think Richardson's going to end up going to the first round. And to be honest, if he's a late first round draft pick, it was the right choice, because he's going to make, $8, $9, $10 million guaranteed. And he's going to get to his second contract quicker. And if he turns into a star, that second contract is going to be worth $300 million. And you aren't making that through NIL. You're probably not even making that if the NCAA opened, or if the conferences opened up their TV money. So good luck to him. Like you said, a little bit disappointing. Like if he'd have come back, he could have been a Florida legend. But I don't think little kids grow up thinking these days that they want to be a legend at the University of Florida. I think most kids grow up thinking they want to throw the game-winning pass in the Super Bowl. And so Richardson's going to have an opportunity to pursue that dream, and good for him.
Oh, let's be real too. I mean, Pat Mahomes is a great commercial for Texas Tech quarterbacks. And I mean, look at the jobs Cliff Kingsbury's gotten just because he coached the guy. So Cliff Kingsbury's an NFL coach because he coached Pat Mahomes in college. So,
well, the good news is he might be Florida's offensive coordinator in a year if Napier decides he's to do that, because I'm not sure Kingsbury's going to last a lot longer.
Well, I'm saying you can, if Richardson goes in the NFL, even if he didn't have that high level of success at Florida, if he goes into the NFL and develops into that, that's a great commercial for the University of Florida at all times there. So, good luck to Richardson going forward. And yeah, that's all she wrote for AR-15, man. That's tough, man. I was hoping he'd come back next year, but good luck. Jervon Dexter, another guy jumping into the NFL draft. No surprise here. I mean, this was a guy from day one when he signed. Will, the size, the speed, the athleticism. I don't think we ever saw him become a complete dominating force up the middle, but you see him constantly. He does occupy multiple blockers. He's got, he's got that size. He's got that speed. He's got the athleticism that scouts are going to drool over. And I don't know if I don't expect him to go in the first round necessarily, but maybe a second or third round seems pretty safe for him.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see where he goes. I mean, he certainly has some familial situations. He's got a young kid, and then his father passed away right when he came to Florida. So there's probably some outside things that are making this decision easier for him in some respects. But again, I don't blame anyone for going to take the money if they have the opportunity to take the money. And certainly, I would hope that people are giving him accurate information about where he's going to be drafted. It's not as though he ever made an all SEC team, though. Right. And granted, he didn't have a lot of help, and the Florida defenses were bad when he was there, but he's a part of that Florida defense. And so I do wonder whether that will be held against him. That you look at, team where you've got 2 interior defensive linemen on every all SEC team. And there are some all SEC teams that even go out to 3 teams. So you look at that, that's 6 guys that he in the conference that he's being ranked behind. And I think that's legitimate. I don't think that I don't look at his statistics, and I don't look at the impact that he had on the field and said, oh yeah, he's better than these guys who are getting named to the all SEC team. Now, some of those guys aren't going to the draft, and the SEC obviously is the best conference in the country. At the same time, you're not talking about a guy who was like elite at Florida and just didn't have any help around him. It was a struggle at times, and that's not necessarily Dexter's fault, and a lot of that has to do with scheme and just the talent around him and those. I mean, if a guy's wide open, you're not going to get to the quarterback and those sorts of things. But he never made any like special game-changing plays. Now, with all that said, I was watching a Bears-Packers game a little bit this weekend, and TJ Slayton was all over the place and was absolutely manhandling the offensive line for the Bears. So it's not as though a defensive tackle who has not succeeded at Florida hasn't been able to go to the pros and show what he can do. But I think in terms of draft, like I would be surprised if Dexter was a 2nd-round pick. I'd be surprised if he was a 3rd-round pick. I think 4th or 5th is what I'd look at. Now, again, we'll see what he does when he's at the combine and his pro day and all those sorts of things, and maybe that'll move him up. But you just look at the film, and there are triple teams that he's taking on that look really impressive, but there's not like this burst where he's getting into the backfield and causing havoc all the time. And when you're talking about a relatively small, because Dexter is a relatively small defensive tackle. He's not like a Will Fork nose tackle, right? He's not that guy. He's more of who's the guy for the Rams? Aaron Donald.
Oh,
He's more in that mold, right, where he's trying to be disruptive. No, I'm not comparing him to Aaron Donald, but he's sort of in that mold, and he
were you
hasn't
doing
been
an
in the
Urban
backfield
Meyer
that
impression,
much.
by the way? There,
What? Not being able to remember his name?
the Aaron Donald guy, that 99 is pretty good.
Oh yeah, well, I don't know. I'll go kick my kid in a couple of minutes, and
Sorry, Urban.
then deny it when he accuses me.
Cheap shot there. My bad. I don't know. I can see Dexter being someone that's pretty. He just looks like a guy that played for like the Baltimore Ravens. He just seems like a good fit for what they do up there. But I think he's also. He might not be that all pro. Like you say, he wasn't all SEC, might not be an all pro at any point in his career. But if he stays healthy, fairly safe bet to have a 8 to 10 year NFL career. I'm guessing. I would guess with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dexter's going to be a solid pro. I
Yeah.
don't know that he's going to be a star. And that's sort of the same thing with him that you say with Richardson, right? Is I think Richardson was a solid contributor this year. I think we always thought he might take the next step to be a star. It was sort of the same thing with Dexter. Like he was a solid contributor this year. And it's when is he going to take, and even last year, and when is he going to take that step to be a star? And he just never took it either. And so you're left with this, oh man, these were the guys who were supposed to be the dominant forces at Florida, and they weren't. And now they're going off the pros. Hey, you wish them well. It's a whole new era. Billy Napier's bringing in new guys. But at the same time, it's a little bit of wistfulness because, 3-4 years ago, we thought that Gervon Dexter was going to be the start of sort of the influx of talent that we were going to start to see. He was sort of that first 5-star guy that Dan Mullen was able to sign, and it just didn't materialize.
Let's move on to Osiris Torrance. I'm going to go off of Gator Dave's tweet from Monday. Florida offensive lineman Osiris Torrance was named to the 2022 All Southeastern Conference first team. The league announced Tuesday afternoon. Well, I guess this would have been from Tuesday, not Monday then, Will. Torrance is the first Florida offensive lineman to be named All SEC first team since Marquise and Mike Pouncey in 2009. Excellent season for the transfer from Louisiana, Will. A Sports Illustrated. I did a quick look up of mock drafts here. First 3 I looked at, Sports Illustrated, Pro Football Network, and CBS Sports, all had Torrance going in the first round of their mock drafts. It seems like scouts are in love with this guy. All the mock drafters have him up in the first round. Doesn't seem like he'll fall into the second based on what I'm seeing.
No, I don't think so. I think he was the best player on the team this year, and it wasn't even really all that close. And you think about what Florida was able to do on the ground, and Torrance was a big part of that. Ethan White, too. I don't think we should undersell Ethan White. He also made a couple of all SEC teams, second team, I think, for the AP, but then I think he was on the first team for PFF along with Torrance. So Ethan White has been a good player now for a couple of years. We should acknowledge that. But Torrance was the best player on the team, best player on the offensive line, and quite honestly, maybe even the best offensive lineman in the country. Now at a guard position, which is less in demand than a tackle position. And so, from the standpoint of where's he going to get drafted, if he was a left tackle and I said he was the best offensive lineman in the country, he'd be a top 5 draft pick. I don't think that happens because guards are just not as valued in the NFL, but certainly you start getting down to that 14, 15, 16 range. That's when you start to see the interior offensive linemen go off the board. And that's also where you start to see teams that have issues, but also have the ability to turn things around pretty quickly. And they say, hey, if we can get help on the offensive line, this will help. So you think about like the Bengals, right? Like that might be, depending upon where they end up overall in the draft, that might be a great place for him to be. The Colts haven't been able to protect anybody, though that's probably a little bit early given what happened to them against the Cowboys the other day. But those are the sorts of teams I think you look at and say, this guy's gonna be able to make an immediate impact. Hey, the Buccaneers, right? If Tom Brady comes back for his 75th year in the NFL, I think
They could use a few.
yeah, I mean, God, Brady was like overcoming holding calls the other day to get the game-winning touchdown there against the Saints, and so certainly on the offensive line, there are a bunch of teams that can use some help. Torrance is going to be a big part of that. He's going to be a first-round pick. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Yeah, you could pretty much. I think any team would be happy to have Osiris Torrance. To tell you the truth, just another poster boy though for the offensive line production that Billy Napier and his staff have put out into the NFL here. Well, Rob Sale included. Rob Sale had a lot of good prospects at Louisiana with Napier. So if you're an high-level offensive lineman looking to get to that next level, another guy that Napier and them can hang on the wall and say, hey, look, this is what we did for this guy.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see what happens with Cameron Waits. He was the transfer that came from Louisiana, didn't play this year, at least not much at all that I saw. And, but he's a big guy who didn't necessarily play football his entire life and then comes to Louisiana and immediately transfers to Florida and was one of the guys that Napier really went after when, because he didn't want to go and strafe the Louisiana program. He didn't try to do that. He probably could have, but he didn't try to do that. But Waits was somebody who he immediately went and got, just like Montreal Johnson, just like Osiris Torrance. And so, if we want to talk about his evaluation capabilities and his development capabilities, Torrance was already, all conference by the time he decided to transfer to Florida, right? So you're getting
he lived up to the hype he came with.
Absolutely. Yeah. But we knew we were getting a finished product, and it was just a question of, can you keep him healthy and can he do the same thing in the SEC that he was able to do in the Sun Belt? He answered both of those questions in the affirmative. Waits is the guy that they brought in and they targeted and said, this is a guy who's undervalued, but we think is going to be a star left tackle because of his size, his measurables, his athletic ability, and because of sort of his inexperience at the position. And we're going to take him with us to Florida. So he's the guy I look at really when I say over the next couple of years, if Cameron Waits ends up being a star left tackle at Florida, then that's where I start saying, okay, like we need to start really paying attention and giving Napier props for his evaluation skills on the offensive line.
Mentioned this last week when we were talking about the end of the first year and the 6-6. How does this one feel versus the last one? And we're comparing it to what happened down in Coral Gables this year with Miami, where you walk away with no identity. I got a lot of confidence in the offensive line in this program after this past season here. And yes, we're losing Torrance, but their ability to seemingly pump out lineman after lineman at Louisiana seemed to translate here to Florida. When was the last time the offensive lineman was the strength of the team? Well,
I mean, Florida's run the ball pretty well the last couple of years. I don't necessarily want to denigrate the offensive line. I think they were pretty good last year, at least on the ground. I think there's always been weaknesses, and I think there were weaknesses this year that they were able to paper over, and sometimes Anthony Richardson was able to paper over. And I think they're going to need to fix that.
I don't remember that being the entire conversation during the John Hevesy era, though.
Oh, sure.
There was a lot of concern about the level of recruitment and the level of development that was occurring when they were on campus.
Well, and here's the deal, though. The level of recruitment discussion is not going to change because the level of recruit who's coming in on the offensive line is not that much higher than the level of recruitment that was coming in under Hevesy, at least thus far. Mm-hmm. And that is a place that they need to improve. So if they can bring in a guy like Samson Okunlola, I think he's from Massachusetts, then hey,
Massachusetts. Yeah.
all of a sudden now you're recruiting at a higher level, and you can start to transition that. Look, the diamonds in the rough are important. They're critical. The development of the guys are critical, and it's interesting. I'm working on something right now where I'm looking at recruiting ranking and performance. In Texas just completely underperforms its recruiting ranking all over the place. And you're like, what in the hell's going on there in Austin that they're so bad compared to where they're recruiting? And USC's been the same way. And so coaching makes a difference, right? Clay Helton and Charlie Strong and Tom Herman and some of the other guys who've been at other programs that have underperformed. I mean, that makes a difference, and development makes a difference. But the way I sort of look at it is, Osiris Torrance, especially if the offensive line is where you're developing, it's critical to the success of your football team. But it's a lot like the Golden State Warriors who have Draymond Green. Right, Draymond Green is critical to what they do. He's probably going to end up being a Hall of Fame basketball player, and they drafted him in the second round, which means they got him for cheap for a really long time. But Draymond Green isn't Draymond Green without Steph Curry and Klay Thompson. And so having those elite guys, and they drafted both of those guys, I think, in the top 10 of the draft. I know Curry was at the 5th pick overall, or maybe the 6th, maybe the 7th, because I think the Timberwolves took 2 point guards right in front of him, like a bunch of morons to take Curry. And then you've got Klay Thompson, who was like, I don't know, the 10th or the 11th pick overall. And so you've got those 2 first-round picks, and then they signed Durant, and all of a sudden that Draymond Green's really, really valuable because you've got these guys around him. So give me DJ Lagway, give me Okunlola, and then if Cameron Waits is the right tackle and he turns into that diamond in the rough, well, now you've got an offense that's just, you got a quarterback and 2 tackles who can protect him, and you're feeling really good about where you're at. But just getting the diamond in the rough isn't going to be enough. And I think that's sort of the thing that this season proves, right? Even though Florida maybe had one of the best offensive linemen in the country and was able to run the ball, the offense couldn't be consistent because the rest of the team was not in a place to be able to say, hey, these are elite guys all the way across the board. I mean, I texted you earlier today. There were more guys from the state of Florida who made the all SEC team than guys who were on Florida. And that's a problem. That needs to reverse. And the minute Billy Napier reverses that, I think that's where we're going to start to see progress. But look, I mean, I think Torrance, from the standpoint of giving confidence that this staff knows what's doing from an evaluation perspective, absolutely. And now let's surround him with Steph Curry.
You didn't think you were going to get NBA draft talk here in the NFL draft section. That's good. That's why you tune in to listen to Will Miles. Hey, Brenton Cox also obviously declared for the draft as well. So I think Cox, you're looking at again, no doubt about the talent there, Will, but I think there'll be a lot of questions about, hey, so why did your season end early? I think there'll be some of those questions that might keep him out of the first round, but definitely has the level of talent to where he could be an interesting player in the right scheme, in the right on the right team in the NFL.
He's not going first round, dude. Like,
no, I'm not thinking that, but I'm thinking his talent of the explosiveness he has off the edge is extremely valuable. If you're not a guy that's getting booted off your team, I think he could be potentially somebody that could work his way up. But because I think he's going to test well, and I think his size, his measurables, and his speed are off the charts. But it's like you said, the film. I don't think the film's there for a first round grade for him either. But I do think in the right situation, he could be an impact player pretty early on in his career if he's in the right situation in the NFL.
Maybe. I mean, I suspect he's probably going to be like a 5th or a 6th round draft pick, maybe even undrafted free agent, depending upon how the interviews go. And, and how he deals with the fact that, one of the things I think was interesting, I can't remember what player it was, but essentially they were showing him film of all the screw ups and seeing how he reacted to it. And that'll be one of the things that I think, dealing with success is easy. It's the dealing with the failure that becomes the hard part. You think about the timing of Brenton Cox being dismissed from the team right after a loss to Georgia, where, that Georgia game obviously is an emotional thing for him because that's where he was originally, right? And then he comes to Florida. So you can understand why he's emotional. At the same time, that does say something about his ability to handle failure. And so he's going to have to prove to folks in the NFL personnel box offices that he has either learned from that, or he's going to have very good answers for what happened. And again, you and I don't have inside information about what happened. We can just sort of read from the outside and, look, coaches talk, right? Billy Napier's going to get some calls, and he's going to be more honest with the personnel folks than he was with the media when he just said, it's a cumulative level of events. Nah, he's going to have people call him up who want to know exactly what happened, and he's going to tell them in some way. Now, I mean, I think in some ways he's also going to kind of protect his player, right? He's not going to sit there and throw him under the bus. But as a coach, my dad deals with this in his profession where, they're recommending people all the time to different places because they're supposed to move around. And, if you recommend somebody and they turn out to be a complete dud, no one ever comes back and asks you for advice ever again. And you don't want to burn those bridges. And so I don't think Napier's going to go out of his way to harm Brenton Cox, but I don't think he's necessarily got a relationship with him where he's going to go out of his way to make it seem like, smelling like a rose coming out of here. Right. So it's an uphill battle for Cox to get more than like a fourth or a fifth round space. Somebody may take a shot with him because pass rushing is so important, but
Bill Belichick.
Yeah, I don't
see
know.
that'd be a nice little day 3 pick for New England, and just Belichick's out. If you give up the edge, I'm cutting you. Just make sure do something where he's not aggressive, but not going too crazy about don't go for every fake handoff on the planet. Like I could see him getting coached up by the right guy in the right situation and being pretty effective at the next level.
Yeah, there you go, buddy.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to 6 bits. Talk about the transfer portal here. It's ever evolving. As of Tuesday night, when we are recording this here, there are 17 players in the portal. We've already mentioned on the show Braun, Ortiz, Wilcoxon, Elksness, McDowell, and DeJuan Black. But since then, Helm, Reynolds, Lingard, Wright, McMillan, Corey Collier, David Reese, Muggerball, Lee, Jalen Lee, Chief Borders, and Summerall, all in the portal. That's 17 so far for Billy Napier. Man, that's it's a huge number. It's a huge number, but got to think it's along the lines of what Napier is wanting to do to clear out space and start to get some of his guys in there.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of schools of thought here. One is if you look back at the Dan Mullen era, he was still winning in 2020 with a lot of Jim McElwain's recruits. And I don't think that was necessarily healthy, right? I think the fact that his recruits couldn't take over and find their way forward. Now, some of that was us complaining that, he never plays the young guys and thinking that he was playing, games with seniority, but maybe those guys just weren't good enough because it turns out when all those McElwain recruits left, the bottom fell out, and we've had guys who have underperformed for the last couple of years. The other aspect of this is that if I look at the list of guys who are leaving Florida, there's 4 guys who are actual contributors this year who would have been contributors had they come back next year. And that's Richardson, Torrance, Shorter, and Dexter. Those are the 4 guys. The other guys that you listed, none of those guys is somebody who was necessarily who did something on the field that was so significant that you go, oh, that guy's going to have a bigger role. Right. And that's just the reality. That doesn't mean they couldn't have built into a bigger role, but they were going to have to earn it. And they were going to have to earn it in a way that they hadn't earned it this year, because especially on the defensive side of the ball, the defense was so bad that if those guys like McMillan and those guys like DeJuan Black before he was dismissed and the guys like any of those defensive guys that you listed, those guys are going to they would have made their way into the lineup if they were truly going to be difference makers. You have to imagine, right? And again, on the offensive side of the ball, I'd say the same thing. The offense was inconsistent enough that if you were going to really make a difference, that you would have found your way into the lineup. So yeah, is Napier cleaning house and bringing in the guys that he wants in there? Absolutely. Does he think he can probably get better guys through the transfer portal than the guys he's got there? Absolutely. Did he have some difficult conversations with some of these guys who maybe wanted to stay at Florida, but were told they weren't necessarily going to get playing time and that there wasn't going to be a scholarship for them? I suspect that happened as well. But I mean, look, we wish all these guys well, but none of them were really, like, very few of them were major contributors to this team this year. And it was a 6-6 team. And so I look at it and I just go, at some point you got to have the turnover, and probably sooner is better than later. And Napier's just sort of accelerating that turnover right now. And the new rules for transfer portal and NIL allows you to do that maybe in a way you couldn't in the past.
Yeah, I think we almost have to look at some of these names as cuts, almost like the NFL. It's like the NFL now. There's a couple names. Any names that really stand out to you that are a little disappointing? I was surprised to see Reynolds hop in the portal. I wasn't thrilled to see him hop in.
Yeah, that wasn't one that I think necessarily people saw. And especially after his breakout performance against Vanderbilt, that was something that you're like, okay, this is something we can build on, especially since wide receiver is a position of need, even with Reynolds in the fold. Wide receiver is going to be a position of need. And so they're going to have to bring in more guys there, potentially through the transfer portal, but also, but also through high school recruiting. But I mean, again, if you ask me who's the impact player that you want on the roster last year from this year, the only guy I say is Pearsall. I think you could make a case for Shorter, but I think out of all the guys that you looked at and said, who's the guy who on third down is going to get open? It's Ricky Pearsall. And so they're going to have Pearsall coming back, and they're going to have ETN coming back, and they're going to have Montreal Johnson coming back, and they're probably going to have all the offensive linemen coming back except for Osiris Torrance. And, we'll see who they add to the offensive line from both recruiting and the transfer portal. But from an offensive perspective, assuming that they can figure out the quarterback position, I think the offense is going to be in a better position next year. And then the defense was such a dumpster fire that, I just look at it and go, in some ways, I think you just need a fresh start. And, does that mean that they're going to take some giant jump up on the defensive side of the ball next year? That I don't know, because guys like Ventrell Miller and Amari Burney, who have not necessarily been the best linebackers over their career at Florida, though Ventrell Miller played very, very well this year. But, those guys have weaknesses and those guys have deficiencies. Are they good? Shamar James makes the all SEC freshman team this year. Can he take a leap? I think he got an awful lot of playing time. There's going to be an opportunity there. Derek Wingo started to play towards the end of the year. Is he going to have an opportunity to step up and become a star? Certainly his talent profile suggests he might be able to do that. And then you look at the guys that they may bring in through the transfer portal, just like you think about Missouri bringing in Tyron Hopper from Florida last year. And then all of a sudden he terrorized Stetson Bennett in that game against Georgia. So there's going to be an opportunity to sort of supplement various positions where you're a little bit thin through the transfer portal. And, like I mentioned, there's so many guys in the transfer portal. I think there's going to be opportunities to add depth where if you just wait for all the musical chairs to finish. I mean, there's some guys you're definitely going to want to go after, right? You think about a guy like Devin Leary or Drake May at North Carolina, if he decides to transfer, if he decides to enter the portal, like those guys at quarterback, they can really make a difference, obviously, especially considering the hole that Florida has at quarterback right now. But just once the musical chairs settle, I think there's going to be a lot of really solid players who are sitting there who just need a place to go. And it's not necessarily going to cost you a lot from an NIL perspective to bring those guys in, because there just aren't going to be enough open spaces. And, this has happened with the transfer portal for a while, where a lot of guys have gone into the portal and a bunch of them have had to drop down a level because there hasn't been an open space for them. Well, Napier kind of has created a lot of space by all these guys going into the portal. And there's going to be an opportunity to bring in guys that he wants and potentially get some guys who aren't going to cost him money. Because that's the question that I have is, the inflation at the high school recruiting level is so high that the transfer portal only matters if you can start bringing in these guys who of similar talent who cost less money. If the transfer portal is basically just high school recruiting with the exact same price tags, then you may as well just go get the high school guys.
I'm paraphrasing here, but I saw a tweet from Deion Sanders today that said something along the lines of, I'm seeing a lot of, I'm blessed to receive an offer from Colorado, and not a lot of, I'm committed to Colorado. He's like, spots are filling up. I love that approach. That's great. And I think some of that with the transfer portal, a lot of these guys jump in thinking that they're just going to go play at this school or that school. I don't know if those spaces are going to be necessarily available to the level of which these guys are thinking in their head. Now, situationally, like guy like Lingard, I love to see him go somewhere and like get some carries, get an opportunity to show what he's got, potentially make a run at getting drafted. Naquan Wright lost out on carries this year. Love to see a guy like that go out. Those are two guys that can be productive in different places. So, it's good for these guys that they're able to get out from underneath a position where maybe they're a little stuck, buried on the depth chart too. And there's a good legitimate reason to move too. But for those of you who are tired of the transfer portal already and are thinking like, hey, this is like even more out of control. It's getting more and more out of control. I did hear an interesting theory from Bud Elliott. He was talking about the transfer portal that a lot of the guys that are in the position to transfer right now, they were recruited during COVID times where you weren't taking official visits, and maybe they have their first full season on the field, and now they got a chance with NIL. They also committed before NIL got big. So you got a chance to really go visit places and secure a bag for some of these bigger players. So that's why you might see some big names jump into the portal this offseason. I have a feeling, though, going forward, the NIL stuff, you got to think they're going to start baking some language into here where I saw Jordan Travis is coming back at FSU, right? So Jordan Travis, I'm assuming he's getting paid a decent amount to come back, but that's a guy who should get paid. Like, I'd love to see those type of guys get rewarded And I'd love to see the conferences get together and say, you're only going to give high school kids this much, like cap it so that everybody's working off the same number for a high school kid. Because look at Texas A&M, you got all these kids coming in for 1 year and they're dipping out. So how like for people who are not crazy about the degree to which the transfer portal has gone crazy, do you think we'll see a reduction in with NIL, and do you favor some sort of cap system with high school kids?
I do not favor a cap system because these kids have a limited opportunity to make money. This is not like you get a second stab at the apple, and they're not collective bargaining. If the NCAA wants to collectively bargain with a union that's associated with the players, then I'm much more okay with an agreed upon salary structure or something like that. But until it's collectively bargained, no, that's bad for the players, and I'm not in favor of anything that's bad for the players. As far as like what you said about guys getting a bag and then moving on elsewhere, I mean, Ish Harris for Texas A&M retweeted something the other day that I saw where I think you might have pointed out to me, Nick, where essentially somebody goes, "Man got his bag from A&M and then went where he wanted to go afterwards."
He retweeted it
and he retweeted it. So he's sitting there going, "Well, at least this guy's honest about it," and that's going to happen. So I think in many ways the inflation. So A&M was ahead of the curve. And A&M decided, and it was funny. Everybody sort of like gawked at the $30 million number that was being floated out there, and Jimbo Fisher got all mad about it for some weird reason, even though he wasn't doing anything wrong. And everybody sort of looked at that number and went, "Oh my God, like this is getting out of control." And then you look at it and go, "Well, what would 12 top 100 guys cost you these days for a class?" It'd be a heck of a lot more than 30 million bucks. And so Texas A&M was ahead of the curve and got a deal. And you look at a guy like Ish Harris or anybody else at Texas A&M, they're going to look around, and if the language wasn't tight to keep those guys at a certain place, I mean, look, the NIL deal that was leaked by the lawyer who negotiated it for we're thinking it's the kid up at Tennessee, the quarterback, Iamaliva, but that one that was leaked had language that essentially did not allow him to sell his name, image, and likeness rights again, right? That essentially that contract locked him into the university. Now, he could leave whenever he wanted, but he couldn't renegotiate another deal at a different school or with a different collective or something like that. I think you're going to start to see that.
There's going to be incentives of some kind baked in.
Yeah, but the problem is that like Bud Elliott was saying, in 2020, these guys essentially got nothing or they got something under the table. And Fisher was funny about that. He's like, "We've always had NIL. Now you just know what the deal is." So these guys got a bag at some point, but that bag that went with them was not. There's no limit to it, right? They have an opportunity to cash in again. And I don't begrudge them that, right? You came here, the NCAA has given you the ability to transfer. You have a very limited time to maximize your revenue. And quite honestly, if college football didn't treat these guys like it was a meat market, I'd feel like, hey, there should be some loyalty and that sort of stuff. But college football has been exploiting these guys for almost free for years and years and years. You hear a story about like Marcus Lattimore back with South Carolina and sort of what happens to him and the money that he gives up because of just a nasty injury that he experiences there. You think about Willis McGahee and the injury that he has in that national championship game. And that's the risk these guys are taking when they go out there. So if you have an opportunity to maximize revenue and move, then fine. But again, I think what's going to happen is that you're going to start to see contracts at the high school level that lock in NIL rights in some capacity. And so it's going to prevent the transfer to someplace else to go, "Well, this guy offered me this much, I'll offer you this much." I think what it means is you'll see a lot more flipping at the high school level when those guys are coming towards the end, because everybody's going to be competing. It'll be like, in Major League Baseball where 3 teams are bidding on the same guy. And, up until the 12th hour, up until midnight, everybody's bidding on them, and they'll have to make a decision. So I do think you'll see some more flips at the high school level.
Yeah, I think it's going to correct itself in the market over time. So I don't think it's always going to be this degree of transfers, but maybe for the next couple of years,
it's still going to be expensive though. The reality is that there's so many people who love college football and get some form of identity, especially at the booster level, some form of identity for the college football program that they care about being good. And if you have so much money that $2, $3, $4 million doesn't bother you, just giving that up, then you had an option 2-3 years ago. You could give that to the university. You could give that to somebody who is going to find a way to underhandedly give it to a recruit. And those were really your options. Now you have an option to sit there and say, "I want to target that guy." right? And you can help target that guy, and you can sort of get access to the coaches and the university if you're the guy who's actually providing that sort of money and those sort of incentives. So I don't think prices for the top guys are going to go down. I think that's still going to be crazy because inevitably we know that those are the guys who deliver wins. And these guys develop, like, there's an identity associated with being a booster who's helped the team win in that capacity. So I think for schools that have big time boosters, the prices for these 5-star kids is going to keep going up. I think the portal will calm down, but anybody who sits there and goes, well, there's going to be a bubble at some point, people are going to stop spending money on these high price recruits, the 5-star guys. I don't necessarily see that happen. I think there's a limited supply of those guys. There's only 30 of them every year, and there's more than 30 teams who want them. So the price is going to keep going up.
Well, fascinating to watch, that's for sure. A lot of turnover now for the Billy Napier and the Florida roster here. All right, let's move on to a dollar. New hires, Will. I just want to get your quick reaction on a few new hires. USF in Tampa hires Alex Golish, the offensive coordinator for Josh Heupel. Hendon Hooker in that Tennessee offense. USF gets a guy here that they're going to come in. You know his identity. You know what they're going to do. I think that's something that I thought Jeff Scott was going to do a great job at USF coming in under Dabo. He kind of handpicked the job, has Florida ties. Brad Scott, his coach, his father was a long time Bobby Bowden assistant there at Florida State. I thought those type of ties would really help in building them in recruiting, but they really never did an elite job recruiting under Scott. They never established a true identity on the offensive side of the ball, and they just kind of struggled from year to year, culminating in a 1-win season this past year, although they almost beat UCF to spoil the Knights' AAC title bid there. But Alex Golish, I think it's a great hire for USF, a young up-and-coming coach that's going to come in here, and you're going to play a fun style of football and put up a bunch of points. I like it.
Yeah, I'm thrilled with this one, but mainly because there were rumors that potentially Deion Sanders might be the one taking this job.
Yeah.
And from a recruiting perspective in the state of Florida, that was going to be an issue for Napier and Cristobal and Norvell, right? That having Sanders in there making noise there was going to be an issue, and I would not have wanted that one. This is going to be fascinating to see. Heupel, it's in many ways, this is sort of like the Urban Meyer brings his offense with you, and then, hey, is Dan Mullen the guy who was just sort of riding Urban's coattails, or was he an integral part to things? I think you can say the same thing about Heupel in Tennessee and his offensive coordinators. Is it his offense, and these guys are helping it, and they've learned from him, but they don't necessarily have the touch or the feel. And you see that all the time with different coaches who guys leave their programs and you go, oh, well, they had a great defense, so we're going to bring this guy in. Saw this with Saban year after year after year after year. And that was one of the questions with Kirby, right? Was, hey, he was the defensive coordinator, but Saban is a defensive guy. Is the success on the defense due to Kirby, or is it due to Saban? And obviously Kirby's answered a few of those questions, though hopefully we'll
reserve judgment until after the playoffs.
Well, hopefully he'll fail to answer that against Ohio State. It's the first time in my life I got to hold my nose and root for the Buckeyes. But anyway, so I think it's fascinating. It's always a fascinating question to me when you get a guy who has been an offensive coordinator in a dynamic offense. And I think Tennessee, in many ways, was sort of doomed to take a step back anyway with Hendon Hooker leaving. And now you've got the offensive coordinator leaving as well. So I'm more interested in what happens at Tennessee than I am at USF. But yeah, I think you got to take big shots, right? When you're a team like USF or even UCF or FIU or any of those teams that isn't going to be able to recruit with the big boys there in the state, you're going to get talent, though, because there's a lot of talent in the state. And so, hey, yeah, let's play a fresh, up-tempo, exciting style of football. Even if you lose 50-48, it's fun. And then all of a sudden you start winning 50-30 because you're able to start to get a few stops and those sorts of things. So yeah, I think it's a good hire for USF, but I mean, we both thought the same thing about Jeff Scott, and obviously that didn't turn out so well.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I definitely like that offense, though, and I like the idea overall at USF. And Florida's got we got that third game of our 3-game series left with them. So I don't know. I don't think it's next year. I think it's a couple of years from now, or 2-3 years from now. I don't know. But USF's coming up, so we will probably run into him again at some point. You mentioned Deion Sanders. Deion Sanders takes the Colorado job, leaves Jackson State. A lot of criticism from some angles about Sanders leaving Jackson State, and I don't know if I would go as far as say people are saying he's abandoning the mission there with the HBCUs, but I don't know how you can remotely criticize this guy, because he did more to put the HBCU schools on the map for the recent history of college football than anyone has in a long time. Certainly there's a lot of great history there. Anyone that's a history buff with college football knows a lot of the great players that have gone through those schools. But Sanders, Jackson State, been a massive storyline in college football for the last couple of years here. And going out to Colorado, I was just under the impression that Colorado had no money as an athletic department, that they've been a mess for a long time. And when I first started hearing his name associated with Colorado, I didn't think they had a shot at him. So I'm a little stunned that he's taking this job here. But man, you can't really start. Like, there's not much expectation with this job. So if he comes in and elevates it, which no doubt he will be primed to take another big job. Maybe when Florida State, when they're done celebrating, like hanging a banner for going 9-3 with Norvell, and they're 8-4 and 8-4 and 8-4 again with Norvell, they'll get a little tired of it and finally give the guy the job out in Tallahassee. But not saying Norvell deserves to lose his job right now, but it just feels inevitable that Deion's going to end up at Florida State, because I think this Colorado thing is going to go pretty well, Will.
Maybe. I mean, we'll see. I think the criticism of him leaving the HBCU is that you looked at that. If you're somebody who identifies with Deion and identifies with HBCUs, then the expectation is that Sanders had made enough money in the NFL and through endorsements and those sorts of things, that the power and sort of the ladder that is necessary for most coaches was not necessary for him. Right. That if you had a real rising star at an HBCU, that guy's not making a ton of money. And so turning down a job at Colorado, you're turning down life-changing money for your family. If you were a guy who, say, was a college quarterback who worked his way up through the ranks and then became a head coach at an HBCU. And so, yes, he brought a lot of notoriety to that place, but at the same time, he was one of those guys who I think you were like, well, okay, he might stick around because he doesn't necessarily need the things that most coaches need in that space. What that ignores is that all coaches have giant egos, and you don't get to be a great coach without having a giant ego and without wanting to prove yourself against the best who are out there. And Sanders is going to have an opportunity to do that at Colorado. Now, I think he's going to struggle a little bit because of what you said about Colorado and the resources. And maybe he got promises about the kind of resources he was going to have. Maybe it'll be like a Mel Tucker situation where he's there for a year and then all of a sudden a better job opens up and he jumps ship and goes there too. So there might be some opportunities with that, but if this is a long-term marriage between him and Colorado, I don't necessarily expect it to go all that well. Just because
long-term meaning what? I don't see this, for the record, I don't see this more than a 3 to 5 year deal, whether it's good or bad.
I think if he's still there 5 years from now, best case scenario, we're talking Pelini, right? We're talking 9-4. Hopefully he's walking in the stadium with a cat and we're having a grand old time as Colorado plays, Utah for the right to go get demolished by USC in the Pac-12 championship game. Pac-12 is obviously an easier conference than some other places that are out there. So
USC's leaving the Pac-12, so it's going to get even easier.
Well, that may be true, but look, I think Oregon State is a good example. I don't think they go 9-3 in the SEC. I don't think they even come close to going 9-3 in the SEC. And so he'll have an opportunity there, but I'm not expecting him to do fantastic. I think he'll do better than his predecessors, but I think 6-6, I think 7-6 seasons, 8-4 seasons are probably where he caps out. And the question is that enough for people to say, well, he moved the needle in Colorado and took them from an awful program to a decent one. And so we think he can then move things forward. I mean, look, Spurrier was out there winning ACC titles with Duke. And granted, they lost a couple of games that year, but still, he's winning ACC titles. I don't think that's going to happen with Deion at Colorado. But again, if he does that at Colorado, I think that proves his bona fides. And absolutely, if a big time job opens up, you don't think he's going to follow Saban in Alabama?
Man, that would be good. He would probably crush that job.
Definitely be a culture change. Absolutely.
I think he'd be insane there. But that's why I was alluding to the criticism about him leaving. It's like he's done a fantastic job at Jackson State. If he wants to go take the next job, who can fault him for that? Like if he does a great job at Colorado and he wants to take a bigger job, who can fault him for that? I think he's doing a good job and he has the right to go make that jump if he wants.
He has the right, but I think one of the things he talked about was making sure that he sort of saw it through. right? He had talked about seeing through getting the guys that he brought in into the NFL draft and showing that you could bring in big time recruits to HBCUs and get them all the way to the NFL draft. And we'll see if that still happens. If the guys that he brought in, particularly the kid that he flipped from Florida State there, that made us all laugh a little bit when he flipped from Florida State to Jackson State, if those guys end up going to the pros, whether Deion's there or not, I think it sort of proves the point that he was trying to prove. And so I think people will look back on things favorably. If those guys transfer out to like go play with him at Colorado, then it leaves a little bit different taste in people's mouths. And so we'll just sort of have to see how it develops.
It's like a year ago, Louisiana was mad about Billy Napier taking people from the portal too. There, Will. So it's just the new reality in college football. Sanders took a bigger job. I absolutely don't fault him for that at all. Now, you said not highly successful. 12-team playoff official as of 2024. Rose Bowl just finally gave in and caved in and agreed to whatever they needed to agree to get that done. Colorado, could they be? I could see Sanders having them in a 12-team playoff by year 3 of his time out there.
I see anybody being a 12-team playoff at this
12
point.
teams,
Like
not that hard.
I'll have an article coming up maybe this week, maybe next week. I've been working on it for a while, and I'm trying to pare down. I've got a ton of data, and I'm trying to pare it down into something that's actually readable and doesn't just bore people out of their minds. But there are definitive tiers in college football. You can see it pretty definitively. And what the playoff is going to do is it's going to open up access to some of those tiers where the results are a lot more random. You think about the Michigan State team that made the playoff, you think about the Washington team that made the playoff, and now the TCU team that made the playoff this year. But it turns out like the top 5 teams in recruiting based on average player rankings since 2014, those teams have won every national championship since they started the playoff.
Wow.
And so I think there are. So if you're going to put money on somebody, put it on Georgia or Ohio State because they're in the top 5.
Well, I did that article back in January where I went and I counted all the playoff appearances like dating back to the like 25 years. I think I did, and I think some Ohio State was like 23 of 25 years. Ohio State's in a 12-team playoff.
Oh yeah, and that's what's going to happen is the big boys are going to be in every year. People are going to get upset because there's going to be 6 SEC teams in one year.
Yeah,
and there's going to be the ability to. What I'm curious about is we wound up with this weird argument with Mike White where he constantly got Florida into the NCAA tournament. And there are people who are like, well, he got us into the tournament. That's a big deal. And then there are people like, look, 64 teams making the tournament. That's not really that big a deal. Like you actually have to like perform and be a good team during the regular season. Just getting in the tournament isn't enough. And so if 10-3 gets you into a 12-team tournament, but then you get slaughtered because there's such a difference between the top 4 teams and even really the top 2 teams and everyone else, then does it really matter whether you make that top 12? And that's the question that I have is it going to spread out the talent a little bit more because you can get 12 teams in? Is it going to, when guys like Saban retire, is it going to bring people back to the pack so you have a little bit more parity? Or is it just going to be, we end up with the 4 we would have wound up with anyway, except now we're arguing about 12 and 13 and Skip Bayless is getting all upset, but I just really don't care because the 12th and 13th team aren't winning the title anyway.
Hey, Dan Mullen would have been a 3-time playoff coach. First 3 years he's in the 12-team playoff.
Well, and that does, so
I think he's getting fired if that's the case.
Well, I think there are a couple of things there. I think Mullen is capable of scheming in that case. Like we always talk about recruiting versus on-field or versus development. I think development starts to take more of a precedence if your only goal is to make the playoff, and if 8 of the 12 teams are essentially on par with you from a talent perspective, then you might be able to scheme past those 8 and get into the Final Four, depending upon what your draw is. But I think for the most part, you're probably going to end up getting slaughtered when you get into that Final Four if you're trying to accentuate that. But this is one of those things, right? When Kansas year after year after year under Roy Williams was getting to the Final Four but wasn't able to get the job done, like Roy Williams was still seen as a fantastic coach, even though he couldn't get over the hump. And just get like college basketball teams fly Final Four banners, right? I don't know. I would kind of be embarrassed if Florida started flying playoff banners just for making to the Final Four. Now, we haven't been able to do that yet, so we haven't seen whether they will.
Just keep them aside, and when it becomes socially acceptable to do so, we'll bust them out. Right?
I mean, I'm glad they took down the SEC East championships that they had there in the swamp. But, you don't do that in college football, right? It's a national championship. It's an SEC championship. Those are the 2 banners that you fly. And I don't know whether that's going to change, right? Is getting to the Final Four of a 12-team tournament all of a sudden going to be more more of an acceptable result? Like if a team makes it to the Final Four 3 years in a row, do you go, oh, this coach is doing a good job, or do you go, well, like he's not getting over the hump, and maybe that's program to program, right? We just won't know exactly how it's going to sit. So I'm really curious to see what happens as they expand out to 12. I actually think it's going to have some major implications in recruiting. There's some baseball analogies that I think are going to come into play. I'll be writing about that this offseason in terms of how teams manage what they're doing and how they spend money when they're in the major leagues, just because of the randomness of the playoffs. And I'm curious to see whether that same attitude is taken in college football.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's going to change a lot of approaches there with 12 teams being in now. I have. Oh, I'm going to limit. We got 4 left here. I'm going to limit you to a 1-word response on Tim Beck to Coastal Carolina.
Eh.
Yeah, Liberty. Jamie Chadwell, the old Coastal coach, he's taking that Liberty job. Liberty's got more money than you think, but I don't know. Coastal to Liberty, will. Not a giant jump in my eyes there.
It's the what was the word that who was it who talked about a job being oh god, what was the word that was used? Was it when Mullen went to Mississippi State? Somebody called it, or was it when he went to Florida that they called it I can't remember the word, but that I can't remember the word to describe it. But basically, it's an equal jump, right? I don't know that he's upgraded here.
Yeah, I think that's about the same. You could definitely use Liberty as a platform to jump up to another job. We've seen a couple of coaches do that at Liberty, including Hugh Freeze, who just went to Auburn. FAU Tom Herman. How do you like that hire? The former Longhorns coach. You just went from one failed Power 5 coach to another. If you're FAU, it didn't go so well with Willie. You did see Tom Herman have a lot of success at Houston, though.
That's a win. Taggart was terrible at Florida State and was good at USF. Herman was good at Houston, and then he was okay at Texas. And in fact, if you look at his record at Texas compared to Sarkisian, you might even say that they pulled the trigger a little bit too early there on Herman. I think Herman's going to do a good job there.
Yeah, I like the hire at FAU. UAB, Trent Dilfer, good high school career up in Nashville. I believe he was coaching. He's been doing coaching for a few years now at the high school level. So not a surprise given his name that he would jump in for this job. UAB's been a solid program since they've come back from the dead. What do you think of Trent Dilfer to UAB?
This sort of feels like Saturday going to the Colts, doesn't it? Where it's like, oh, we need a coach. We got a relationship with Dilfer. Bring him in. He's just got high school experience. This will be good. He's got to learn the recruiting game as well as becoming a head coach at the college level. That's a lot, right? And Dilfer, I think, knows more about football than any of us will forget more about football than any of us will ever know. But at the same time, that doesn't always translate. The good news about Dilfer is he has experienced failure. And a lot of times you see guys who didn't experience failure struggle as head coaches, and the guys who were sort of, mid were able to do it. Well, Dilfer was obviously a very good college player, and then struggled in the NFL at times, though he was able to win a Super Bowl kind of. I think we might say that the Baltimore defense won the Super Bowl, but I think it's a challenge. Like the one word I would use, challenge for Dilfer.
Let's finish with Hugh Freeze to Auburn.
Interesting. This is an interesting mesh.
Oh
man, it's like
I love it. I love it.
Like the rumors of him at Ole Miss, we all knew that he was that recruits were, all of a sudden Ole Miss is like recruiting like Alabama. You're sitting there going, oh well, this is interesting. You got the whole Tunsil incident right before the draft. You got the hookers being called on the cell phones and all that sort of stuff. And then goes to Liberty, which is amusing in its own right, considering the sort of origins of Liberty, and bringing in Hugh Freeze, who used to be called, I think it was Reese Davis, called him the Reverend Hugh Freeze, and now he's back in Auburn, and I just can't wait for one of the boosters to stab him in the back a couple of years from now, if he isn't beating Alabama in the Iron Bowl on a regular basis. But he's either going to be the reason why Nick Saban retires, or he's going to be the reason why Nick Saban gets a 10-year extension, and I don't think there's a whole lot of in between. So variability, I guess, is the answer here. He's either gonna be great or he's gonna be a flop, and it's gonna be entertaining the whole way.
Odds of Hugh Freeze having a 10-win season either this year or next at Auburn.
70%.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. I think he's going to do some good things out there. But I'm with you. I think it's going to be it's just the right kind of fit for Auburn. It's what you'd expect.
It fits the
Uh,
personality, all the stuff that normally
it's
goes on. It's
so
dysfunctional but
good.
effective, right?
It's
It's
so
like,
good. Yeah,
yeah.
love it. All right, that's our show tonight. Any final words before we head out, Will?
Just thanks everybody. Hope you had a happy Thanksgiving, and obviously we'll be back a couple of times before before the game against Oregon State. But hope everybody has a Merry Christmas as well. This is always a fun time. Make sure you spend time with your family. Spend time with your Gator family too, because college football is almost over. Make sure you get an opportunity to spend time with your friends right before the holidays hit.
We'll be back next week. Have a great week, everybody, and go Gators.
Go Gators.
Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel. Join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week. And check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knutson, joined by Will Miles. And as always, go Gators.